Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton-Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching my stories, I unearth tons of intriguing historical information that doesn't end up in my books. So I've created this channel to share these tidbits with you. I appreciate you stopping by to watch. When you hear the name Eleanor Roosevelt, what comes to mind? Longest-serving First Lady for sure, and perhaps that she married her fifth cousin once removed. Maybe that she was part of the prominent Livingston family and a niece of Theodore Roosevelt. But there is so much more to this intriguing woman. Born October 11, 1884 in Manhattan, New York, Mary Eleanor Roosevelt unfortunately had an unhappy childhood. Her mother nicknamed her Granny because of her serious nature, and by all reports is said to have rejected Eleanor. Other scholars indicated Eleanor's mother was ashamed of her plainness, which is unsurprising in an era when looks were important to the wealthy who presented their debutante daughters into society with the goal of snaring a husband. When she was 2 years old, she was on board the SS Britannic with her parents and aunt when it collided with the SS Celtic. When they were lowered into a lifeboat and taken to the Celtic, which returned them to New York. As a result, Eleanor feared ships and the ocean for the rest of her life. 5 years later, her mother died from diphtheria, and her brother Elliot Jr. died of the same thing the following year. Her father, an alcoholic confined to a sanitarium, died from a seizure when she was but 10 years old. She was then raised in the household of her maternal grandmother in Tivoli, New York, where she was tutored privately until attending Allenswood Academy in London when she was 15. The headmistress, Marie Silvestre, took a special interest in Eleanor, and they remained close until Marie's death many years later. Eleanor learned to speak French fluently and gained much self-confidence during this time. In 1902, she finished her education, returned to the U.S., and shortly thereafter had her coming out party, an event she later described as, quote, simply awful. A beautiful party, of course, but I was so unhappy because a girl who comes out is so utterly miserable that if she does not know all the people. Of course, I had been so long abroad, I had lost touch with all the girls I used to know in New York. I was miserable through all of that, end quote. She survived the event and got involved in other activities typical for a young socialite, the Junior League and teaching children at Rivington Street Settlement House in New York's Lower East Side. She also became a member of the Consumers League and participated in the investigation of sweatshops in the city. During the summer of 1902, she met her cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, while on a train to Tivoli. They began to correspond in secret and over time fell in love. They became engaged on November 22, 1903. FDR's mother was against the marriage from the start and did what she could to discourage and even break off the relationship. In 1904, she took FDR on a Caribbean cruise, but he remained adamant that he would marry Eleanor. The wedding date, March 17, 1905, was determined by her Uncle Theodore's availability because he was the one giving her away. He was in the city for the St. Patrick's Day parade, and his attendance at the marriage ceremony made for front-page news. After a week's honeymoon at Hyde Park, they then headed to Europe for a 3-month tour. Unfortunately for Eleanor, her mother-in-law's interference began as soon as the couple returned home. She provided a townhouse in New York City that connected with her own and featured sliding doors. By all reports, Sarah Roosevelt ran both households. Eleanor later spoke about her breakdown, during which she told Franklin, quote, I did not like to live in a house which was not in any way mine, one that I had done nothing about, and which did not represent the way I wanted to live, end quote. However, despite the incident, nothing changed. 2 years after the birth of their sixth child, Eleanor discovered love letters to Franklin from his social secretary, Lucy Mercer. She offered him a divorce, but Franklin's mother and his advisor, Lewis Howe, felt it would be political suicide. In fact, several sources state that his mother threatened to disinherit him if he followed through with a divorce. The two agreed to remain married, but the relationship was gone. Eleanor became active in public life and focused on her social work and causes. When Franklin fell ill in August of 1921 with what has been referred to as a paralytic illness that doctors diagnosed as polio, but since 2003 some scholars surmise may have been Guillain-Barré syndrome, Eleanor stepped in and made public appearances on his behalf. She also started working with and raising funds for the Women's Trade Union League, whose goals were to create a 48-hour work week, minimum wage, and the abolition of child labor. In 1927, she and two of her friends purchased the Todd Hunter School for Girls, a finishing school that also offered college prep classes. Eleanor taught upper-level courses in American literature and history. That same year, she established Valkill Industries with three other friends. A small factory was built which enabled local farmers to supplement their income by making furniture, pewter, and homespun cloth. Franklin continued to climb the political ladder, holding various positions in New York politics before becoming governor of the state in 1929. By the end of his term in 1932, he had received the Democratic nomination for president. Some might say that to Eleanor's dismay, Franklin won the election. One source indicated she was quote-unquote seriously depressed at having to assume the role of First Lady. She had seen her predecessor Lou Henry end her activism upon her husband's election, stating that she would act quote-unquote as only a backdrop for Bertie. However, with support from Lewis Howe and Franklin, Eleanor redefined the position, which caused much controversy at the time. Americans weren't used to seeing their first ladies front and center. Eleanor wrote a daily and widely syndicated newspaper column entitled My Day, a monthly magazine column, and hosted a weekly radio show. She held regular press conferences, and after learning that most female journalists were barred or at least discouraged from covering the White House, Eleanor prohibited men from attending. She maintained a heavy travel schedule, making personal appearances at labor meetings and schools, especially those run by African Americans. As a result, she had a strong connection with the African American community, going so far as to invite hundreds to the White House as guests. In 1939, when singer Marian Anderson was prohibited from performing at Washington's Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution because of her race, Eleanor resigned from the group and coordinated the concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. 2 days later, war enveloped the country, and Eleanor moved her focus to wartime causes. She lobbied Franklin to increase immigration for groups under Nazi persecution, but fears of fifth columnists and political repercussions caused him instead to restrict quotas. She did, however, manage to secure political refugee status for 83 Jewish refugees in August of 1940, but unfortunately most of her requests were denied. An attempt to travel to Europe with the Red Cross was also denied, Franklin's advisors pointing out the consequences should the president's wife be killed or taken as prisoner of war. She turned her sights back to the home front and co-chaired the Office of Civil Defense with New York Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia, working to expand the role of civilian volunteers. She wrote a small film, Women in Defense, that was produced by the Office of Emergency Management. Throughout the war, she advocated for increased roles for women and African Americans, advocated for their use in the defense industry a full year before it became common practice. After she found out that absenteeism rates for working mothers were high, she campaigned for government-sponsored daycare. She did manage to do some travel, going to England in 1942, where she visited American troops and inspected British forces. The following year, she visited American troops in the South Pacific, but criticism by political opponents that she was using scarce wartime resources caused her to curtail her trips. After Franklin's death in 1945, Eleanor continued with her public life, being appointed a delegate with the United Nations General Assembly in December of 1945 by President Truman. 6 months later, she became the first chairperson to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights and played a large part in drafting the organization's declaration. Throughout the 1950s, Eleanor conducted countless national and international speaking engagements. She continued to pen her newspaper column and made appearances on television and made radio broadcasts. She averaged 150 lectures a year throughout the 1950s, many devoted to her activism on behalf of the United Nations. In 1961, President Kennedy's Undersecretary of Labor, Esther Peterson, proposed a presidential commission on the status of women, and Kennedy appointed Eleanor to chair the commission with Peterson as director. Later that year, after the Bay of Pigs incident, President Kennedy asked Roosevelt, labor leader Walter Reuther, and Milton Eisenhower, brother to the former president, to negotiate the release of captured Americans with Cuban leader Fidel Castro. Eleanor died on November 7, 1962, at the age of 78, leaving a long and lasting legacy. I hope you've enjoyed today's moment in history. If you'd like to learn even more, please stop by my blog found on my website at www.lindashentonmatchett.com. And please consider subscribing to my channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications of new episodes that release on the second and fourth Fridays of each month. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day.